Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, a very warm welcome to you for this event. Thanks for joining us for a topic which could not be more important in order to address one of the major issues of the world, which is climate change and how to finance it. A very warm welcome also to the EIB Vice President Thomas Östros. We started to talk about the question of how to finance energy projects, and we were middle in the discussion when we were interrupted by my secretary. They reminded us that we have an opening to do. Sorry for that. You could see how much we were already in the middle of it. I assume a lot what has been said will deal with some of the micro financial issues there. What I would like to do is, in order not to increase the time which you have to wait for the truly important speakers in the panel, with essentially three considerations from the point of view of a central banker. The first one has to do with energy prices and inflation. The second one with energy prices and financial stability. And the last one has to do with the link of energy investment, a possible link, energy investment and the equilibrium interest rate. There may be a link which could perhaps form a win-win situation. Now, the impact of energy prices became very visible when we had not only first the price increase in the East Asian part, but then when it was doubled up by the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine, when they suddenly had a major price shock. Now, this price shock permeated everywhere, and to the surprise of some of us, it led to a very broad inflation, which is not surprising because energy is used essentially by all processes. So if prices increase, essentially everything is affected there. But inflation not only has this broad effect, but also what it does, it changes, if it stays on, it changes inflationary expectations. And with the change of inflationary expectations, what happens is that if they go up, it gets much harder to bring them down again. And what we saw is that the inflation expectations by consumers, the latest ECB Consumer Expectation Survey said that from March that the inflation over the next 12 years, 12 months, not years, increased from 4.6% to 5%. Quite an increase, and it may be one of the reasons why we have this inflation persistency, with which we don't know really how best to attack it, quite definitely with rising interest rates, but it may not be sufficient. Being credible in our inflationary pursuit, this inflationary pursuit will be one major part of it. And so having some expectations about energy production, and particularly the one which is important to contribute to a green transition, will be an important part of energy investments, and I hope main avenues will be found. A second part where energy prices concern central banks is, of course, that energy price increases, shocks, put in danger financial stability. Because what we see is that when energy prices start to increase, what also happens is then that the expenditures increase, which reduces the profits of firm, which reduces then the capacity to pay back the loans for which money has been taken up. And we saw the effect, fortunately, for the time being, only really in stress tests. And we did some stress tests last year in which, on the assumption, we looked up what would happen if we would have a disorderly transition and energy prices would increase at a certain moment. What would it mean? Well, it emerged that, of course, some enterprises will run into difficulty. But the good thing is, under our assumption, which we used last year, it showed quite clearly that for the time being, we are still in good territory, that the energy price changes that have taken place for the time being would not create a threat to financial stabilities. But perhaps our assumptions were too modest. Perhaps worse things can happen. I hope it won't. And the last part is the link between investments, green investments, investment generally, green investment in particular, and the link directly through some of the constraints of monetary policy. What I mean by that is one of the key determinants of monetary policy about the size, but also about the instruments, is the natural rate of interest. So that interest which a rate which conceptually brings supply and demand together at stable inflation and unemployment. And what has happened is that this rate has decreased over the last 50 years or so. And the result of it coming closer to one that created a problem of the lower bound required that we move into unconventional monetary policy, which may have had some bearing on the inflation because it created a lot of money supply and liquidity in the system. So one of the things which we could get out or reduce our pains, if and as we would have something which could increase the real interest rate, the natural rate of interest, again. And here, some people think that the high investment need for energy change, even better for innovations in energy change, would be one element for at least temporary increase of this interest rate. Because if this were to be the case, what we would have then, a much easier life for central banks, because it would allow us to move up from the effective lower bound, and we would could give up with good conscience the unconventional monetary policy, which some of us consider to be a threat for our money autonomy. So with these few comments I made and linked it to the topics which I'm familiar with, I wish us all a productive seminar, and I hand over now to the Vice President for his opening words, and I'm looking forward to the keynote speech, and at least to the opening of the panel afterwards. I have to move out again, but thank you very much for joining us here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Governor and ladies and gentlemen. It's a true honor to be able to be here to take part of this seminar with a theme that is very close to my heart. I'm Vice President of the European Investment Bank, and among other things, I'm responsible for our energy lending policy and energy lending. So this comes very handily for me. And I must confess that we have started just a few minutes ago a very interesting conversation with the Governor in your beautiful office on the challenges that we have ahead, especially the challenge to continue to do innovations in the field of energy, because I think this is really needed. We have seen in Europe that the public and the industry and the actors on the markets their patience with very high energy prices are relatively low. I mean, we have got used to having energy prices that are handleable for consumers and industries. And we've gone through a period of time now that is a little bit reminding of the energy crisis in the 1970s, with the price shock hitting consumers and industry. And this is not a place where we want to stay for any longer than absolutely necessary. So the European Investment Bank wants to be a key player in the energy transition. And in some countries in the European Union, EIB is very well known in its details. In others, it is not. In my home country, Sweden, if I ask somebody on the street, they are not really aware what European Investment Bank is. They might even mix it up with the European Central Bank if you ask them. But I'm sure in Austria, everybody knows. But it is a relatively large public international bank, and in fact, the world's largest multilateral development bank, with a balance sheet reaching almost up to 600 billion euros. So we have firepower behind what we want to do. And already in 2019, the board of the EIB took, at that time, quite a radical decision. They said in the new energy lending policy that we are not going to finance unabated fossil fuel-based energy production anymore. At that time, that was a big step. And of course, you can understand with the 27 member states within the European Union with very different realities on how they get their energy, that was the decision that demanded a lot of discussions. But in the end, the member states said, yes, go ahead. So since then, we have sorted out that type of lending, concentrating on renewable energy, energy efficiency, which is, of course, an area where we could do a lot more in Europe, and interconnections, of course, seeing to it that the grids and the connections between energy systems that is often national based still is more tightly connected. So that became the direction. Then came this brutal aggression from Russia, invading Ukraine, throwing Europe into an energy crisis with skyrocketing prices. And of course, we started to discuss internally, what is the right thing to do at this time? Is the member states, our shareholders, demanding from us to scrap the policy and go back to invest in everything that can secure Europe's access to energy, also gas, coal and oil? After thorough discussions, we went to our board and said, we think that the best idea at this time for us and for Europe is for us to stay on course. Because are we going to get energy independent in the future? It is renewable, it is energy efficiency, and it is better interconnections that must be the solution. And we were fully supported by all 27 member states. Stay on course. We are struggling, each of us individually and together within the European Union, but we want you to be the actor that can push us into this more sustainable development. Since then, we have also taken a decision to increase our energy lending substantially. Usually, in a steady state, we lend about 12 to 13 billion euros per year in energy-related lending. We have now, to support Repower EU, the Commission initiative, decided to put additional 30 billion euros the coming 5 years on top of that, and that would mobilize additional 115 billion euros of investments overall. And even in the next board meeting we will start to discuss, could we top up that even further with additional 15 billion, and then mobilizing up to 150 billion extra additional energy investment the coming 5 years. And the reason is that we see that demand is growing very strongly. So we will devote this lending, of course, to the areas that I mentioned, but also more strongly into innovation. And we think that we can be of additionality in that respect, taking a bit more risk in cooperating with the Commission, and we get Commission guarantees from InvestEU, and do it also on our own balance sheet, take on more risk to help to push the frontier a little bit. Not least in hard-to-abate industries, which Europe are looking at now very vigorously to see, To be competitive in the future, steel, cement, aluminium, all these traditional industries that we have been so strong with in Europe need to change, or otherwise they will be wiped out the day when we reach carbon neutrality, not least, or even way before that. So we are looking now, for instance, in Sweden, we are doing our due diligence on H2 green steel. Greenfield steel investment from basically a startup with very strong investors behind, where hydrogen production based on renewable energy, so green hydrogen, is integrated into the steel making process to make the steel carbon free. And they are now making contracts with customers that knows that if they are going to be able to sell their cars or whatever it is in the future to customers that have high demands on carbon neutrality, they need to have green steel. And thereby, if we go in, we can play a crowd-in effect. When we go in and take substantial lending with InvestEU as a guarantee, but also on our own risk, we can get private capital to also go in at the same time. We managed to do that with Northvolt, the EV battery factory that is now established in northern Sweden, and H2 Green Steel could be another example. These, I think, is a role where we want to be, being a crowd-in bank that are able to support innovation in the field of energy to support European leadership in that field. So we are delighted to have this conference here today in Vienna, hosted jointly by the Austrian National Bank and the European Investment Bank. And I'm especially thankful to Governor Robert Holzmann for making this event possible and for hosting this event. And it is a well-established tradition to present the findings of EIB investment survey in Austria and together with you discuss its implications. This has been a very constructive dialogue in the past, and I'm sure that we will see that also today. Let me just add a few words before we start our panel discussions and the presentations of the survey. The last couple of years has been transformational, not only for this generation, but for probably also for generations to come. The global pandemic, the war, the fundamental insecurity spreading around among investors and in the economy, energy price hikes and inflation hikes. Also here in Austria in a very visible way. Talk about a poly-crisis environment to deal with. We've seen also policymakers taking unprecedented action. Central banks, governments, global institutions have all acted very strongly to try to handle this type of situation. Energy insecurity, to start with, is making us address both the lack of energy efficiency of our economies, where we have a lot of low-hanging fruits, but also the over-reliance that we have on fossil fuel, not least the reliance we have had for so many years on Russia. While European firms are facing profound challenges, there's a growing evidence that firms are also coping with these challenges. The latest result from the EIB investment survey shows that Austrian firms, for instance, have reacted decisively. Policymakers' response was also unprecedented, yet the downside risk will require probably additional action. The poly crisis has maybe a chance to be also a poly opportunity. But how to turn this situation into an opportunity? First, of course, investments are key to unlock the resilience that we are facing, to meet the challenges that we are now facing. Austria's economy had a strong recovery over the past 2 years, much thanks to the companies that continued to invest. Indeed, according to our survey, Austrian firms invested more than EU firms on average. The latest results from the survey are shown that the energy costs have become one of the most important investment barriers for firms in Austria. While we also see that they are taking steps to become more energy efficient and less dependent on fossil fuels, more policy support is needed to achieve energy resilience. Another more structural issue is emerging, which we have seen since the EIB started asking Austrian firms about challenges to investment. I'm speaking about skills and skills shortages, which is increasing and in a worrying pace as it hampers firms' competitiveness and ability to innovate. Here in Austria, it is even higher than the EU level, and this despite, as we know, the education level of Austrian population is among the highest in the world. On the positive side, Austrian firms score high relative to EU peers in terms of digitalization and the use of some of the most advanced technologies such as big data and artificial intelligence. And that is probably one of the reasons behind skills shortages. If you lie in the frontier, you often end up in looking for the talent that you need. As the EU bank, the EIB stands ready to help firms in Austria to manage the crisis. Fostering a fast transition towards net zero is one of our main objectives, and financing of innovation and skills is also high on our agenda. The EIB provides predictable long-term financing that can help in times of uncertainty and at a competitive cost, which is becoming increasingly relevant in a world of tighter financial conditions. A year ago, we were working in an environment of zero and even negative interest rates. Of course, the demand for our type of lending has increased substantially compared to a year ago. The European Investment Bank, which is the lending arm of the European Union, has been working in Austria since 1973. In total, financing 315 projects worth of 34 billion euros. In 2022, the EIB group, consisting of the EIB and our equity arm, the European Investment Fund, provided total financing volume in Austria of 1.6 billion euros. SMEs were the main beneficiaries, followed by a strong investment focus on innovation, digitalization, and human capital. We also supported modern infrastructure in the field of sustainable cities and regions, as well as sustainable energy and natural resources. We have taken our role as climate bank very seriously in Austria. Last year, for example, we financed new and very important windmill parks. Looking forward, our pipeline in Austria for the rest of the year remains strong and highly diversified. So, ladies and gentlemen, in face of multiple shocks, sustaining investment is, of course, key to build resilience and enable the transformation towards a greener economy in Europe and in Austria. Let me conclude by saying that the EIB Group and our partners stand very much ready to mobilize private and public investments that are needed. We are open for Austrian projects and proposals, and we are working very hard to see to that they come into fruition. I will now hand over to my colleague Matteo Ferrazzi, Senior Economist at the EIB, who will present the results of the latest EIB investment survey for Austria, and then it will be followed by a panel discussion. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presence, for the people online and those here in the room. So my role is to give an idea of what the Austrian firms and European firms are doing, how they are coping with the challenges. As introduced already, the Austrian firms are taking a number of actions. They are facing a number of different crises. They've been able to recover very fast in the last 2 years, but growth is again slowing down. So the challenges are mounting. And this is true also for the fiscal side, in which many states in Europe are fighting with new challenges, and the states are behind that. So let me start from investments. So this is the key theme of today. So here we are comparing the US and the European Union, and we call them productive investments because we are excluding the residential part, and this is in percentage of GDP. You may see that since the global financial crisis, there is a gap between the two, and this is a very relevant topic because US investments, driven by, of course, the IT, the technology, I would even say not only US, but here is really the big role of the Bay Area and California and IT investments. There is a gap that is always there since more than 10 years, a 2% gap over GDP that is constantly there. On the other side, on the right side, this is our survey, our AB investment survey. We are asking to the companies we are asking to 12,000 companies in EU and around 500 in Austria. We are asking also if they invest in innovation. So typically the firms can invest in expanding their capacity, replacing their capacity, or being innovative in new products, new services. And here you see that this is a share invested in new products and services in Europe is relatively low. Let me now add to the picture Austria. So you see exactly the same data, but Austria is in red. And the picture on the productive investments, so excluding residential over the GDP, is relatively good because there is a positive gap versus the EU and also versus the USA, even versus the USA. So in this sense, you see that the amount of investments of Austrian company is satisfactory. On the other side, you see that the other chart is showing that Austrian companies are mainly investing in adding capacity and replacing capacity, and not so much on the innovation of products and services. So that's quite a relevant point, at least what is communicated by the companies that are, let's say, answering to our survey. So the Austrian companies that are in various sectors, I will show you the breakdown later, are telling us that this share of investing in innovation is lower than EU and lower than USA. And also I found very interesting, we also asked if they were satisfied with the amount of investments. And well, Austrian firms, and this is relatively high in Europe, 17% of Austrian firms say they invested too little. They were not fully satisfied of what they invested during the last years. So that's also an interesting point. In general, the positive news is that Austrian firms are taking a lot of actions. So they are very active. They are investing more than Europe, and there is a gap. So 9 out of 10 firms in Austria are investing. They are also facing been facing very relevant supply chain disruptions in the last years. And here, the Austrian firms are taking action more than in Europe. Also, a very good result for Austrian firms. They're becoming more digital, and this is especially after COVID. Many firms are becoming more digital, and there is a big gap, 15 points, positive gap for Austrian firms versus the EU. And the last aspect I was pointing here is about the use of advanced digital technologies. Again, here there is a 14 points gap in favor of Austrian firms that are using advanced digital technologies. Of course, here we're speaking about the use, not the development. Otherwise, of course, the picture would be different and very much in favor of the USA. Here, I will show you the details here because these data are relatively rare. So these are survey data. You see here a lot of asterisks, but don't worry, just that we asked to different sectors different questions. So we are asking the usage of drones, for instance, only for construction companies. We are not asking for manufacturing and so on. So these you can mainly neglect the asterisks and focus on the main messages here. So the red bar, which means Austria, is performing relatively well versus EU, and in most of the cases also versus US. So once again, this is the use of digital technologies. So Internet of Things, or if you look at big data and artificial intelligence, Austrian companies are quite strong here. 3D printing, augmented reality, digital platforms, technologies, this is very high here in Austria. Robotics, very strong, this is for manufacturing. Better than EU, better than USA, and also the use of drones is more or less in line with EU in the construction sector. So overall, quite a nice picture for Austrian firms, also on the use of digital technologies. But the focus of today is about climate, about energy, and the energy challenge. So I will now focus on this aspect. First of all, let me start from the physical risk and the impact of the physical risk. We always ask to our firms if they are impacted by physical risk. Well, the data is quite surprising because 2 out of 3 companies, they say that they were experiencing losses deriving from climate events. So last year, Austrian firms were again affected, 2 out of 3, by climate events. And this is quite relevant. This is also higher than EU. So you see that climate change is not anymore a distant reality or an ambition for the future, but it's something that the companies are already feeling on their skin. Out of these 64%, 17 they're saying that they had a major impact. So the losses were relevant for the company, and that's quite big. So how they are reacting? The question is, you see that climate change is not a distant reality, but it's something impacting the companies. Are you investing? So we ask various questions about the investments in adaptation. So this is mainly adaptation investments, very, very often backed by adaptation financing by banks or international financial institutions. Well, Austrian firms are behaving quite well, but only few invest in climate resilience. So some firms, they have an adaptation strategy or putting in place adaptation measures, almost 40%. And a lower share, a bit more than 10% of Austrian firms, are also having an insurance against the climate events. Let's move to the transition risk. So the topic of today, energy and transition risk. Here, sorry, there is also this, how Austria is scoring compared to the other European countries. So number 3, number 2 means in the top 3 best positions if we compare with the other European countries. Austria is a little bit lagging behind only in the insurance part, that is 18th out of 27 countries. Let's move to the energy and green investments. So if Austrian firms are investing in general, implementing any step to reduce emissions and to reduce their transition risk, you see that energy efficiency is quite high. So almost 80% of Austrian companies were investing in energy efficiency. I must admit that this in the last years was probably one of the most profitable investment and a very good choice for Austrian firms. And renewable energy is also very strong in Austria. Some of the projects are even financed by AB, as you heard a few minutes ago. So renewable energy is a really important investment for 60% of Austrian firms. And then we have also investments in waste, recycling, in sustainable transport. In all these categories, Austrian firms behave better than the average in EU. So that's another good point for Austrian firms. In terms of ranking, you see that Austria is number 3, number 6, number 1 in Europe. So again, a very important position. According to our survey, Austrian firms are those investing the most in energy efficiency and in renewable energy. Or better, the big chunk of Austrian firms, more than in EU, so more than any EU country, are investing in energy efficiency and renewable. So that's a quite encouraging message for Austrian firms in this sense. But there is always a but. Here we are also asking, how do you see the transition? Do you see as an opportunity, a risk, or you see no impact? First of all, the share of Austrian firms saying that there is no impact is lower and lower every year. This is the gray part, So there is no neutrality anymore. Everybody sees that there is an impact. Could be positive, could be negative, but this transition is becoming more and more tangible. There is not anymore a period to be completely neutral on the topic. So the gray part is becoming lower. The 36% of Austrian companies are saying that the transition is becoming an opportunity. So there is a positive outcome because they are investing, they're selling more green products, maybe they are in the business of renewable energy, maybe they are fostering very much the transition in other countries, for instance, Central Eastern Europe, that there is a huge need of green investments, and Austrian companies are very active. You see that this green bar is bigger than last year and also bigger than EU. This is again positive, but there is a big share, still a big share of Austrian companies that are very worried about the transition. So 31% of Austrian companies, they see as a risk. So this means that they are, let's say, worried, or they're not fully aware how to catch the transition. And this is, I think, quite important. So in this slide, you see the same result as before, but on the right here, I am breaking down by sector and by firm size. And this, our survey is we can do that with our survey. So you see that this red part So those that they see the transition as a risk is bigger for the manufacturing sector. So the manufacturing sector seems to be more exposed to the transition. And also you may see the big difference between large firms here on the right and the small and medium enterprises in Austria in terms of these when they see the transition as an opportunity. So of course large firms are probably more equipped and ready to catch the opportunities from the transition, and SME would be in need of bigger support. As this was briefly touched by also our Vice President, we also ask to our firms to tell us in Europe, like in Austria, which are the main barriers, why you are not investing enough. So Austrian companies are saying, okay, not all the companies were happy about the level of investments, they wanted to invest more. Which are the main barriers? So you see from the left side to the right, the barrier number one was the availability of skilled staff. That's problem number one, is bigger than last year and higher than in Europe, on average. Second problem is the energy cost. So the two things are quite relevant. And the third problem is the uncertainty about the future. And in all the three cases, especially in energy cost and skilled staff, this is higher than in Europe. And you see also the dark bar, red bar, means there's a major impediment. So Austrian firms are saying that the availability of skilled staff is a major impediment. This we see in our survey, as this is the percentage of firms complaining, let's say, or flagging the barrier. But you see also in the hard data of Austrian economy, where Austria is having the highest job vacancy rate in Europe, if we exclude agriculture. So 4.6% is the highest in Europe out of the 27 countries, is the job vacancy rate. So there is some tension on the labor market in an environment where unemployment is relatively low compared to the past, and the employment rate is very high. So 88% is the number 4 in Europe, and many people is really a big percentage of people working in Austria. Last point, I wanted to show you this across time. I mean, some points are not surprising. So the energy cost concerns and barriers to investment are increased during the last years. So in the last 2 years, you see a big jump, and this is rather expected given the spike in prices. Uncertainty is also very high, but uncertainty, I mean, we are able to live with uncertainty. Is always, the world is always uncertain, but you see that in the last year, this is higher than before. What is quite impressive for me is this availability of skilled staff, how much it is increasing during the last years. So the post-pandemic world, also a world in which there are many changes, green investments, need of green skill, artificial intelligence, need of experts, of data scientists, is creating a barrier for the companies to invest. And this, as was already underlined, despite the major investments of the Austrian companies, universities, and a very strong presence also of people coming from other countries to work in Vienna and other Austrian cities. So this availability of skilled staff, together with energy cost, is quite a relevant point. So I hope, and I guess it will be part of the panel discussion that is starting now. So a big thank you to all of you. I hope this will be a very fruitful discussion going on. And I leave the floor to Marina to present the panel. Thank you so much.
Hello and welcome on my behalf once again. Now you can hear me. Welcome to our panel discussion. Our today's topic is financing the future energy systems, the challenges for energy providers and the financial markets in Austria. Let me briefly introduce you to our guests and panelists today. Ms. Deborah Revoltella, Chief Economist of the European Investment Bank. Hello, please come on stage. Mr. Hannes Mösenbacher, Chief Risk Officer of Raiffeisenbank International. Hello and welcome. Oliver Picek, Chief Economist of the Momentum Institute. And last but not least, of course, Mr. Michael Strebel, Chairman of the Board of Management of Wien Energie. Carina Kraus from the Austrian Energy Agency should also have been with us today, but unfortunately she had to cancel due to personal reasons. My name is Marina Delcheva. I'm an economic editor at the Austrian weekly news magazine Profil, and I'm looking forward to a very vivid and interesting discussion with our panelists. And afterwards, I would like to invite you, dear listeners, online and here in the National Bank to join us with your questions. So, according to the International Energy Agency, and after what we heard from the European Investment Bank's numbers, this year we will have an expected global all-time high of investments in clean energy by hitting nearly 1,800 billion US dollars worldwide. We also have growing rates in Austria. Last year, we had a tremendous expansion, for example, in power plants with additional 1,000 megawatts only in Austria. So let me start this discussion with a quite provocative question. And your starting remarks. So, did Vladimir Putin and his brutal invasion in Ukraine following a massive crash and a crisis in the energy system pushed what Greta Thunberg started with her Fridays for Future movement through Europe? How do you see the situation this year? Mr. Revortella.
Okay, so it's interesting to start with a provocative question. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I would like to briefly recap what we have seen in the last year. And I think at the end, it's always true what we think that Europe moves well under stress and under crisis, so that the crisis helps Europe slowly but surely to find a common goal. And I think at the end, if we can think today, what we have achieved in the transformation of the European energy market, I think is not the final deal. We don't have a full integrated energy market. Probably we may not have it in the future as well, but we have achieved a lot. And we have achieved the fact that we actually have been able to decouple for Russian gas and create a huge transformation of the system. And done it in a united way at the European level. If we think where we came, actually it was a massive reduction of import gas. It was reabsorbed by the system at the time in which, for different reasons, Europe also had a shortfall of its production in energy, both from nuclear and hydro, and that was coming at the same time in which gas had to be Russian gas was starting to not flow in, or the transformation. It came through various measures. At the same time, what we also saw was a moment of if you want, a bit uncoordinated panic that emerged with everybody trying to fill the gas storage at the same time. Probably the uncoordinated part at the beginning had also an effect in terms of energy prices. But that was a very important message learned. And actually, ex post, what we see is that today it's taking a much more traction, the fact of coordinated procurement of energy also at the European level. So part of the story was in the transition, the shock part, the panic, uncertainty generated, it reflected on prices, but it turned out to be a lesson learned for the future, move more coordinated among member states. And what else happened was diversification of gas procurement, if you want, from different suppliers. I'm not sure that all of the new suppliers are security of supply that you could think for the future. You also had something that we may not want to see in the long-term energy market of Europe, a lot of use of coal. We also saw a lot of use of LNG, but we also saw a lot of reduction in demand and energy efficiency, and that was extremely important coming together. So partly a structural transformation of the system, emergency management, but also the very strong, and that came very much at the European level, keeping at the center of the policy agenda the fact that the green transition, the net zero transition should go on, was very important for continuing the push and the transformation, and it pushed for the very strong continued investment in renewable energy, in energy efficiency, and what I was saying before, and I think a very important point, was this alignment of policies. The common procurement is something positive to look at. Are we in a final solution on the European energy market? I don't think we are there yet. I think we are still in an unstable solution going forward, in the sense that it's still very much happening how we will move toward the final solution. We need to ramp up much more the renewable energy. We need to find a transition solution in between. But I think that the alignment around the concept of moving in a more coordinated way, and understanding also the lessons of what can uncoordination bring in terms of jumping of energy prices, I think is something quite important to achieve. We are in a moment in which, to continue the net zero transition, we need to massively continue to invest. I think we have, the Commission is estimating that we have to increase by 500 billion a year investment for the net zero transition to 1.2 billion. That's actually quite a number, and I think this requires a combination of factors which are difficult to deliver at a time of tightening monetary policy, possibly in the medium term also tightening a fiscal policy that will come. So delivery on this investment will become more and more challenging. And I think having the clear direction clear is important, but also it's important to make the job as easy as possible for the delivery of the investment that is needed. There, when we talk about renewable energy or also energy efficiency, I think energy efficiency is easier in the sense that energy efficiency, particularly at a time of high energy cost, is an easy investment to sell, because you have the immediate upside of the lower cost, and then it's an investment that repays quite quickly. But otherwise, and also for renewable, I think the certainty on the policy dimension and the certainty on incentive is extremely important, because any uncertainty on the future direction on the policy point of view will derail investment. And also We have learned another very important point. The Commission was quite fast in pointing to that. We knew it very much at the EIB level for our own experience that fragmentation of the European market, the bureaucracy of implementing projects and having the approval process, these are a very important impediment to investment, and dealing with that and simplification is extremely important. And another point maybe that I can mention is what Matteo was saying before about skills. Particularly on the climate net zero transition side, we see it very much both related to public investment and private investment, that both at the local level, at the municipality level, Matteo was not showing it, but we have another survey that shows that municipalities in Europe see very strong gaps in terms of climate investment, both in adaptation and in mitigation. But they say that one of the impediments to execute those investments is related to availability of skills, not only internally in the municipality, but also access to experts that know what to do. So this lack of skills becomes something that delays the implementation, and also people risk to do the wrong thing. That is what you don't want, particularly in public investment, also in private, but particularly in public. So the issue in terms of skills becomes extremely important. So my point is we have seen a lot, and I think we have also seen a lot coordinated. Going forward, it's important that this coordinated stance remains for Europe overall, and I think that looking at executing on the investment needed, it's important to look at the incentive, it's important to look at what we can do to create a better integrated market. So a lot also on the bureaucratic side and the easiness of implementation and the skill point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will come back to the outlook a little bit later. Once again, Mr. Strebel, how do you see the situation nearly 1.5 years after the invasion?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity of speaking here to this very qualified audience. I'm the CEO of WieNenergie. WieNenergie is responsible for the supply of the city of Vienna and the surroundings of Vienna. Just to give you an impression, we have around 2 million customers, because we are supplying not only the city but also the outskirts of the city. So we are supplying 2 million inhabitants with electricity, with gas, with district heating, and with telecommunication. To give you an idea, we have a turnover of 6 billion euros in the last year. Your provocative question was, has the invasion of Mr. Putin pushed Greta Thunberg? In our case, this is not like this. We are focusing on the decarbonization of the energy systems. We have been focusing on the decarbonization of the energy systems for a very long time. We started with investing in renewable energies, I don't know, 10 years ago. In 2019, we made a big, or in 2020, we made a big study. How can we decarbonize a city like Vienna? Vienna has almost 2 million inhabitants. It's the 5th largest city in the EU meanwhile, and it's still a growing city. So how is it possible to fully decarbonize a city like Vienna until 2040? And we had huge investments going on in these things, and we had a lot of study there. And the outcome is, it's difficult, but it can be done. Mainly with 2 measures, and the first measure which I really want to point out, and I was really happy that it was focused by you, that's the point of energy efficiency. It is not possible to decarbonize a city like Vienna is at the current level of energy consumption. It's very important to reduce the energy consumption. It's not possible. We do not have as much renewable energy to keep the energy consumption at this amount as it is. I think that's not a really pity, because there are still
very high potentials in energy efficiency. Not so much in the electricity sector, but there is a high potential, especially in heating and especially in the transport sector. I have the figures of Vienna in mind, so we are the CO2 emissions of Vienna, they come from 20% from electricity production, only 20%. 50% come from heating, from the heating system, and the other 40% come from transportation sector. So to make renewable energy is more than making renewable electricity. Electricity is only 20% out of it. So the heating sector is very, very essential, and the transportation sector is very essential. Especially the cars, they have an energy efficiency factor of about 20%. I think this is really not so much known as it should be. They have an energy efficiency of 20%. So you're using 20% of the energy which you put in, and you throw away 80% of it. Yeah? That's like buying 5 liters milk a week. You drink 1 liter of milk, and you pour away 4 liters of milk. The next week, you're doing the same. You buy 5 liters of milk, you drink 1 liter, and you pour away 5 liters. So that's what we are doing with our cars every day. So there is a huge energy efficiency potential in the mobility sector, especially public transportation in a city like Vienna, and especially in electric cars, because electric cars have an efficiency of 95%. That's a physical statement. So first of all, change the transport system to first public transport systems, and secondly to electricity cars. The heating sector is very essential as well. 40%, as I mentioned before, of the CO2 emissions come from the heating sector. To change that, there is a good chance in Vienna, because we have a lot of geothermal power underneath the city of Vienna. So in about 2,800 meters, there are hot springs. And if you want to use hot springs and the geothermal energy, you have to have 2 prerequisites. You have to have the thermal power, you have to have the hot springs underneath the earth, but you also have to have a big city and a district heating system on the surface, because you cannot use hot springs when there are no customers there. Yeah? So, and the combination of having geothermal energy and a district heating system on the surface, that's only in 3 cases in Europe. That's in Paris, in Munich, and in Vienna. So we have a huge potential by using this geothermal energy. We are exploring this geothermal energy to feed it in our district heating system. The next point in the heating system, what you can really do is the use of heat pumps in 2 ways mainly. You can use the large-scale heat pumps to use all the excess energy which you have. For example, in our sewage treatment plant, there's a huge sewage treatment plant in Vienna, in Simmering, and there is, due to chemical, biological processes, there is some energy which can be used, put up at a higher energy level with the energy heat pumps, and feed into the energy systems. There are small-scale heat pumps in places where there is no district heating possible. And in terms of electricity, the remaining 20%, it's of course in investing a lot in renewable energy, and the renewable energy source of a city are the unused roofs of the buildings for the installation of photovoltaic systems. So we have a very detailed, a very clear plan how to transfer Vienna into CO2 neutral city, and we are deploying this plan step by step, year by year. And I think the brutal invasion into Ukraine has just accelerated this process, but we started it before. So for us, it is now possible because we have these plans it's possible to roll out this energy change. Of course, a lot of investment is necessary there. We are investing around 300 million euros a year, mainly in renewable energy. And of course, it's that there are some difficulties in the process of changing the energy system of such a big city as Vienna is. But I think we'll have the opportunity to discuss it then later, maybe.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yes, we will. Mr. Pisek, may I ask you to your opening remarks, please?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. So did Putin do Greta Thunberg's work? Well, I'm not sure if we do it this way, then through high prices, right? Like prices increasing very rapidly, energy bills going up for consumers, for firms. Then I think we put the whole project of climate protection and ultimately human protection from climate change at risk. I think we need a very active politics in this transition, and also if you simply look at last year, I think a lot of things went wrong. Politics didn't do its part, I believe. So let me say a couple of points where I think things went wrong in the last year, and what could have been done better. Well, the first thing that was interesting to notice that in all the gas, or all of them, or well, almost all of the gas company contracts with Russia, but also with those that were based on LNG. What used to be the case there is that the gas price was connected to the oil price. So that would have meant a doubling of the price. Because the oil price doubled, so the gas price could have doubled as well. But 10 years ago, the company started to change the contracts, and so that in the contracts you had the clause that the price is based on the stock market price in Leipzig, or wherever you're, for electricity and gas prices for say in Amsterdam or somewhere else, right? And it turned out that through this stock market price that simply went up, the gas price went up 5 times, 6 times, right? It didn't just double, it went up 5 times or six times. So of course, if that is passed on to consumers and households and firms, then nobody can pay this anymore, and a lot of what we believe are reasonable economic plans are just become suddenly impossible to do, and economic activity would shut down, right? So that's one thing, and then the politics discussed: should we do some interventions, right? Well, Spain and Portugal did it, right? They decoupled their electricity grid from the rest in terms of pricing, and they did the Iberian model to bring down the electricity price and not let it shoot up that much. And there were negotiations of doing that in Central Europe as well, but they failed. I mean, what's being said is that the Germans don't like it because their gas companies would incur even more losses. But for me, that was a huge coordination failure that happened. That in times of really high prices, you cannot even get politics to agree to some central measures that bring down prices, right? And through this, these very high prices, you had really excessive profits for energy companies. And we didn't even manage to do proper excess profit taxes, right? I mean, we had a very small tax in Austria, but we didn't manage to do that in Austria properly, and we also didn't, I think, manage to do that properly in the European Union. So it was not even clear that all the gains that resulted from Putin's war were then redistributed to households and firms that needed this money in this time of crisis and times of high inflation. So that to me is also a coordination failure that happened. And ultimately, I think we need to make a decision also in the Austrian energy system. Do we want a for profit, like a profit maximization business model, or do we want more the cooperative business model where, for example, Verbund can, if it was a cooperative and not an incorporated enterprise, then it could simply say, okay, I will deliver my electricity to all the other state companies that we have, and I will give a good price, right? I will not just incur maximum revenue, I will not increase prices to the maximum so I can make the maximum profit, which I am obliged to as a CEO. But I will actually distribute those the revenues that I have in the form of lower prices to consumers and to households and to firms. So I think we had a lot of problems, and I'm not sure we solved them. I don't think we did. We were just lucky that in the end there was enough LNG available that could be supplied to the European market. If this had happened to us 20 years ago or 10 years ago, I'm not sure we would now be in the same position. We would probably still have very high energy prices. And if the next winter is colder, right, in a way climate change also saved us because it was a very soft winter. But if we had a harder winter and have a harder winter next year, then I'm not sure we would have been fine the way we are now.
Thank you. And Mr. Müsenbacher, may I ask you for your entering remarks?
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I think it goes without saying that every crisis is a boost to transformation and to innovation and to adjustment. We have seen it as also outlined in the pandemia, which was causing the digital fast-forward transformation, and of course it goes without saying that the war caused by Russia in Ukraine is also another boost towards this transformation. For me, if I go back in time, I think we also have to accept the truth that part of the EU transformation was also based on gas as one of the core element for getting this greening of the energy right. And I think besides the crisis, for me also easy to observe is that technology really has advanced. We have seen break-even prices of the one other solution, is it wind energy or is it solar power panels, are really coming down substantially over the last 10 years. So now you can do a break-even price on solar power panel maybe around about 35 to 40 euros per megawatt hour. This was not available to us as a society just a couple of years back. Coming to the industry, I think that the industry, the financial industry, is clearly committed to support the transition, goes without saying, and you have seen it also on this questionnaire today presented, that the financial and the financing is one of the least restricting factors. Companies have very good cash flows and can finance big part of this transition out of their cash flows. Then we have supranationals participating in the market with very low funding costs. So currently, I believe, honestly speaking, and I see it how many requests I do have for credit approvals, is not a restricting factor. Maybe last thought, the underwriting criteria on how to properly do green transition financing are available long before the innovation have started. So we know as an industry clearly how we have to do the underwriting on such projects, because in the end of the day, anyway, I also need to make sure that I'm financing on a sustainable basis, that I can make sure that the loan has a good chance of being repaid. So what is the biggest challenge? It is the fluctuation of cash flows, and we have seen this in our own experience, that we have financed one or other project, windmill project in a neighboring country, and suddenly the tax regime was changed and the support scheme also has been adjusted, and projects which deemed or looked feasible on paper have changed from one day to another because the support schemes have been changed. So I think also here on the policy front, if we would go for contract of differences and to have also a certain sort of predictability of the cash flows available, because as mentioned beforehand, if you have prices jumping by a factor of 10, of course this is for the one who is running it in whatever basis. It could be a cooperative basis, but it could also be, of course, as said beforehand, to maximize the return on the investment, you need to have a certain sort of predictability in terms of volume, but also in terms of prices. Otherwise, the financing, of course, is also very challenging to have based on which cash flows you could do it. But as said, the underwriting criteria are well known, and I can tell you how I would do any underwriting of a new investment into transitional technology. Just to be clear, nuclear power plants would not belong for us to the green energy.
Thank you. With some final words on the taxonomy discussion, I would like to come back to the gas price, which last summer hit nearly 200 euro per megawatt hour on the international spot markets, boosting electricity prices and inflation as well. We had an EU-wide, very vivid, very emotional discussion on the EU electricity pricing system and the merit order, whether we should change the merit order, whether we need a new pricing system for energy and electricity. Now, I looked up yesterday, gas price is by 25 euros per megawatt hour, which is basically the pre-corona level. Do we still need a new energy market pricing model and probably a new merit order, and how it should look like, preventing future reps, but still favoring green energy resources? Or is this discussion off the table? Mr. Strebler, I would like to start with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's a very interesting discussion going on in the EU concerning energy market design. I'm a representative of Austria in the Eurelectric Forum. That's the forum of all the electricity companies in Europe, and I'm very much involved in the energy market design discussion. I think we first of all have to say we have a liberalized European single energy market, and I think that was a good decision which was taken, 23 years ago. It was by 1999 when the EU decided the green paper and the white paper of Jacques Delors, we can remember that, to liberalize the energy market. I have been working in the energy sector for quite a long time, for 25 years, more or less, and this has the advantage that I know the old regulated system, and of course there are some bad happenings now in the liberalized market, but there was also a lot of criticism for the regulated system as well. They said that's inefficient, they are employing too many people there, there is an inefficient cooperation, and therefore the liberalization of the energy market was done, and I think it was a good idea. It gave us 20 years of very, very low energy prices in Europe, that the last 20 years around that, and I think this was a good idea for the customers and for the companies as well. During the merit order system, I think it's very, very difficult to discuss it because it's very emotional and it's very hard to explain. But believe me, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of economic evaluation, and this system brings the maximum welfare to all of the states. Neither the Iberian model nor the full regulation brings as much welfare to the European states as the merit order system, and as all economists say, it's one of the most efficient mechanisms of allocating demand and supply. The Iberian system was discussed before. I'm not a really fan of the Iberian system. First of all, I think that works only on the Iberian Peninsula because the interconnection to France is very, very weak. It's only 2,000 megawatts, which is more or less nothing. So there is no interconnection to the European market. And in fact, as a result, the Spanish and the Portuguese taxpayers, they pay subsidies to the European energy system because they are subsidizing the cheap electricity, which is then provided to France, for example. So if we had this system in Austria, we would provide with our taxes all the cheap energy in our neighbor countries. So I think that's a system which works if it works, but only for a very isolated and more or less not interconnected part of Europe. So I think that the liberalization of the energy market was a very good idea. We had a lot of efficiency gains there. Merit order system guarantees the maximum of welfare. And there is a huge discussion going on in Europe concerning energy market design. I think it can be improved, the system. You can make it better. There are new instruments like power purchase agreements, like contracts for differences. I think that's a very, very good idea to make it fit for the crisis. Of course, this energy market system was not designed for an energy crisis like we have right now. But I think the most important thing we have to do, we have to go away from all the fossil fuel because investing in renewable energy is the best thing of having reasonable energy prices in the future.
Thank you. Mr. Pisek, I guess you have a slightly different view on the merit order system and on the liberalization of energy markets in Europe. May I ask you for your short answer?
Well, I think when on the Iberian model, implementing it in Austria, of course, alone doesn't make that much sense, but we could have done it with the countries surrounding us. We could have done it for the whole European Union, right? So I think that was on the table, and it didn't happen. So I think that was a failure by politics, by the energy system as a whole, that didn't happen. Regarding the merit order system, well, I mean, it's true that technically the algorithm maximizes overall welfare, and it also maximizes the welfare of the consumer and the producer, right? So of course that leaves a lot of that maximizes in certain times. It just maximizes the profits of energy companies that can produce energy, and that is of course a rather short-term maximization view, because if in the process of the short-term maximization the European industry gets destroyed because they can't operate in Europe anymore because of high energy prices, then that is probably still not the optimal policy, the optimal result for a society out of this mechanism, right? So, and I think we did let Putin manipulate energy prices for a while, right? Now he has failed for a number of reasons that also involve luck on our part, I believe. So it was not just the ingenious policy that we all designed, right, or politics designed, or it was a lot of luck that energy prices are again down. And if that was not the case, then our industry, our economy would be in a lot more trouble than it is already with the inflation that we have. So we did let Putin manipulate the market, the stock exchanges, right? The prices on the stock exchanges that's supposed to bring the optimal outcome. Well, it turns out it doesn't really. It's not as easy if you have an almost monopoly provider for gas that we had, and we still have an unsolved problem there in Austria, especially because we have OMV, the leading energy company in Austria. For oil and gas, they have a contract with Gazprom that delivers, from what's being heard, right? Like nobody knows this contract, but from what's being told, it's 2/3 of the total gas supply of Austria, and it's a take-or-pay contract. So even if we do now decarbonize our energy system, we still might have to pay Russia for this gas, right? So we have a lot of unsolved problems that are not clear on how we're going to solve them.
Thank you very much. In its green transition, the European Union is highly dependent on technology and resources coming from China, partly as well from the United States. Ms. Revoltella, the European Investment Bank, is one of the key financiers of the green transition. Where do you see Europe's role and all the projects that were implemented last year and are planned within the green transition between, on the one hand, America's massive Inflation Reduction Act with billions in green technology, and on the other hand, China, which is also seeking, for example, climate neutrality in the car sector by 2030 and is pumping as well billions into its green transition. Where do you see the European Union and the member states in between those two blocks in its green transition and their dependencies?
I think this is one of the bigger questions that we have at the European level is how to position actually globally in this new context that is developing in terms of globalization or deglobalization, and also related to the whole technological development related to the net zero transition. And maybe the way to start is to start thinking at what was the original reaction at the European level at the moment in which the Inflation Reduction Act was announced, and then how this evolved over time, and then thinking at security of supply or the other side of the story, or de-risking, how it's now be defined in all economic discussion, de-risking of our supply chain. I think on the Inflation Reduction Act, the initial point is, so if you wanted to really consider what it really meant, and you wanted to be optimistic, on the one side it's positive because it brings the net zero transition on the table in the US. So it was a big game changer in terms of US policies, in terms of the net zero transition. It also brought a lot of question mark, particularly in some subsector on areas, particularly when the local content dimension was put in place. And actually what is coming out after a long discussion at all possible level politically, it's coming out that the US was actually planning its own, if you wanted to call it, de-risking from their own strategic dependency from China, and trying to diversify and actually relocalize part of the production, but at the cost of course, putting the local content dimension of discriminating also against other trading partners, like also the European Union. And at the same time, part of the very strong subsidies put in place were risking to bring some of the European companies somehow to reprioritize investment that they may already have to serve the US market and move faster developing there. I think the situation is now rebalancing a bit. On the one side, at the political level, there is a lot of discussion, EU-US, on how to fine-tune the details, but also it's important to think at what can the European market bring to people, and how can we make the European market more attractive for European companies, and try to use the European market as their growth engine, particularly in renewable. And there I think if we look at the EU-US, EU has already a lot of incentives and subsidies coming up, maybe more fragmented, maybe much more difficult to assess the full potential of the public support that is coming at the European level. But it's also true that on the other side, the US subsidies, the US support program, most of the time they come as exposed as tax reduction, and in the meantime there may be political change in the US and maybe they disappear. So there is also some uncertainty on the tax support coming at the US level. But on the European market, I think one element that is quite important, and I go back to what I was saying in my previous intervention. I think there is a lot that Europe can do in order to define the predictability of the operating environment, also for companies that want to utilize the European market or the growth market. And then that comes with a lot of clarity on regulation, clarity also the full discussion on changing energy, the mechanism for electricity prices, etc. It brings again uncertainty on what the prices will be and what the condition in the market will be. And I think the uncertainty is one of the bigger component going against additional investment, and also that's something important to consider. The other point that is important on the European side to consider, a lot of the discussion is on the innovation and where you bring from the innovation phase to the manufacturing part of the production in the new technologies. And here, I think Europe has the usual problem of the scaling up. That is something to be addressed, but it's very much looked forward on the policy point of view. And that's probably one area that is important to look at. But then the other element on the integration of the European single market, the simplification of regulation, harmonization. There are examples that come out, and also we looked at it. We have a huge department of engineers that look at all projects at the European level. They were looking at some cases in which the standard of products between one country and the next change just because you use a different classification system, and then rather than having 3-star is the best, you have numbers or something like that. This fragments the market. So if you are a producer that wanted to sell in the European market, you have additional costs that are just internal fragmentation of the market. So these are things that at the European level we can also look more. As an institution, we are of course looking at all of these angles, looking at the innovation part, particularly the scaling up of firms and how to support better scaling up, and also the industrialization part of these technologies. We are looking actually, Thomas was mentioning before, a lot of first of a kind industrial system to create the examples that then can be replicated in different countries. But I think also the whole work on the regulatory barrier, simplification of regulation is a very important one if we wanted to have this efficiency of the European market.
Thank you very much. When we look at the numbers being invested in the green transformation, Mr. Mösenbacher, one might think that commercial banks are right now very busy in funding wind and solar parks all over Europe with loans, but they are not actually. Why, and what changes, what challenges in the capital market do you see are facing right now?
Well, thank you for the question. I think when listening to Mr. Strebel, I cannot recall exactly what was the yearly profit of Wien Energie in 2022. How big was the profit in 2022 by your company?
It was 5% of our turnover.
But in numbers, in cash numbers, so how big was the profit? Was it 1 or 2 billion? I cannot recall.
So we had a turnover of 6 billion, and it was 4.5% of it.
Okay. So what I can see currently on the market when it comes to financing is that corporates by itself, especially those in the energy sector, having really also inflated by this experience out of 2022, very high excess cash flow. So the companies who really need to invest and who are also strategically committing to this greening of their energy production, they have excess cash flows and they can finance it on their own. Then you have the supranationals saying, well, guys, listen, if you need preferable liquidity costs, because they will also have comparable underwriting criteria as I have, but then we also can do the financing for you. That's the second big cohort contributing to this one. And the last thing, because of course your question have inspired me when considering it, why we see such low volumes, there are two other main things. The one is, if you look at how long is the period for getting a project approved, and in Europe, when talking about wind energy, we talk an average approval period of 6 years. And if you think about solar power plants, we talk an approval period on average of 2 years plus.
You're very lucky then.
Exactly. So what it means, that if these guys and these investors and those project developers who have now decided to come up with a new project of, let's say, for me, these 50 to 100 million euros to look at the investment as a bank, they are maybe currently planning. But in their planning phase, they are not coming to me because they anyway know there is such a big commitment, public commitment for the financing, that financing can be anyway done. So I see little demand currently, and the other one is, this rooftop financing. Hey, let's be honest, we also would have here, the government is the owner of at least 1,000 buildings in Austria, maybe even more if we would also consider those companies being related to the state, or is it schools, is it companies, so that this financing the solar power plants on the roof would also be extremely easy to be done. So I need a certain size, and I have two very important actors, the companies with excess cash flows and the supers also providing cheaper financing when it comes to the whole story. And I also looked up, so besides this long permitting period, I also looked up what was last year the financing done in Europe based on bonds and loans in entire Europe. And having now two guys from the economic department sitting next to me, of course they will challenge me, but I could also give you the reference. It was some 30-40 billion euros in the entire Europe. Hey, this is little money. This is little money. So I come from the other side, as soon as we have a really nicely filled pipeline of projects where the permit is being granted, I'm sure that the financing is available because the political and the commitment of the society is extremely big. Nevertheless, if we may also relate to the merit order, if we say that the merit order, and there are academics in the room, and from the academic point of view, for sure it has its advantages, this merit order, I'm not challenging this one. But I also try to link it to how can you do the financing, and you need to have a certain assumption on the repayment capacity and on the cash flow variation. So if cash flow is varying between 30 euros and 300 euros, it's a little bit difficult to calculate the project. And average is something for accountants and not for banks. So we have to find a scheme where we say, well, if it comes from green energy, we accept that there is a certain price for this energy to be assumed, and whatever the balancing mechanism would look like.
Thank you very much. Mr. Streber, you already told us about the transition in the green transition of wind energy, wind energy. Following the answer of Mr. Mösenbacher, how are you financing it?
First of all, I want to fully agree with you. We really have a problem in Austria of getting the projects deployed. Yeah? So you said you had a project time from 2 years. Congratulations. Yeah, we have projects, wind turbines, for example, and we have deploying, or we're trying to deploy them for 10 years, for example. Yeah. Just to give you an example, we have a wind park in the southern 20 kilometers south of Vienna. We had a time period of commissioning for 10 years. We had a wind turbine installed there, and all the authorities. It took so long, and when we got the permission, the wind turbine was not available, because it was a very old. It was by then a very old wind turbine. We wanted to change it to a new wind turbine, and they said that there's a new a process has to be started. So the process takes longer than the technical duration of these things. So I think we are very clear about that this should not be really the case. But due to energy prices, I know this was an external shock, and it was like in the 70s or in 73 and 79 when we had these energy shocks. But on the other hand, think of it. Energy efficiency is one of the most important things we have to do, and we always complain that there are no price signals coming from energy. So there was no affection on the demand. So we have now the price signals there, and I think they will lead to a very much increase in energy efficiency, which is substantial. And of course, there are some people who cannot afford these high energy prices, and they have to be subsidized by, I don't know, state means or whatever. But I think a price signal as itself is not the worst thing in economies, because it gives you an idea of how valuable an energy is, and that energy has to have a kind of a price. Still, I want to point it out again. I think the only thing where we can really lower energy prices is getting out of fossil energy and making a huge expansion of the renewable energy. Therefore, I would be very glad if the EU goes along this way of the Green Deal again, and I hope there will be no stop signs in this way. We have quite huge investments to take. We have 1.8 billion in investments during the next 5 years, mainly in the heating system, which is a very huge source of CO2 emission, geothermal and energy, getting out of natural gas. That's a program of the city of Vienna. We have 600,000 gas households, and of course we have to remove the gas from there. Also in the production of renewable energy, and also in electricity cars. So we have huge investments to take to reduce the CO2 emission of Vienna.
I have to be really persistent on that question. How, where does the money come from? Where does this 1.8 billion for the transition come from? Is it from your cash flow? Is it public funding? It's not bank loans, obviously. So how do you finance this transition?
Yeah, that's a mixture of all. Partly, as in any other big company, part of it is cash flow, part of it are bank loans. Public financed is more or less a very, very small part, only it's somewhere in the district heating system. There are some possibilities of public funding, so it's a mixture of all.
Thank you. Mr. Pietzek, you were recently pointing out that the biggest financier of the green transition is the taxpayer. When we spoke previously, you also pointed out that measures like the carbon tax might lead to social disruptions, as well as an unfair distribution of the so-called climate costs. Could you please explain us why?
Well, I think there's this big question how to finance the transition. Obviously, companies will finance a lot on their own, but there's also a public part to it, and also about price signals, right? Like we are introducing now, or we already have an emissions trading system in Europe, and before that, before we expand that to, for example, heating, we have a CO2 tax in Austria. But at the same time, we see the social problems that, I mean, it's very good, it's an excellent price signal for investing into climate-related measures. I completely agree on that. But on the other hand, it causes a lot of financial problems for households. I mean, we already have 100,000, more than 100,000 people in Austria that cannot afford to keep their apartment warm, and that was the number before the current inflation and before the increasing energy bills. So it's probably going to be a much higher number right now. We just don't have the data for it yet. And I do see a larger problem that is a bit where I'm not sure where actually I think that we're not using the first best solutions here, right? So if we have a CO2 tax, a carbon tax that is on the level it should be, then we lose political support for it because people don't want to pay those high prices. So economically it's an optimal solution, right? But politically it just doesn't work. So then the political convenient solution is to use subsidies, which the United States does now with the Inflation Reduction Act, and also in Austria that's big, the energy subsidies, and I think we've already planned a lot of subsidies for helping companies with their transition. Right, for the largest steel producing company in Austria wants 500 million from the state for its energy and climate transition. And the question here is, of course, that's politically convenient. Politicians can just spend the money or commit to spend the money. And then, but who pays, right? We need taxes to finance that. And at the same time, the climate transition is not the only transition that we're undergoing. We also have a demographic transition. So the state budgets need to spend a lot more money for care. They need to spend it for pensions. They need to spend it for health. And now we're also supposed to spend it on more subsidies to incentivize firms to do their homework that they haven't done previously, right? Of becoming climate neutral. So for me, that was also in a way the wrong approach, using all these subsidies. And instead, we should focus more on rules and regulation and laws. As we did, for example, for the electric car, that was a very clear signal from the European Union saying by 2035 we should only have electric cars being sold in Europe, right? So those kind of clear political pathways without trying to distribute pushing the costs for that on somebody else and relying too much on incentives. I think these are political decisions that need to be made first, and then companies and households should also not expect, to get subsidies for everything, but also bear a brunt of the costs on their own if they can afford it. But we also need to help, of course, the people that cannot afford it, because otherwise we will lose political support for the energy and the climate transition. And there isn't as much political support for it anyways. I mean, if you look at election results in Austria and also elsewhere in the world, what is really the support for climate policies, right? It plays a much bigger role in politics than actually, I think, does in electoral politics. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like to close our discussion with a final question to all of you. 1.5 years after the invasion, gas and oil prices are sinking again, in general energy prices, while interest rates are rising due to still very high, partly in Europe, but especially in Austria, very high inflation rates. Will these circumstances altogether slow down the renewable extension, or is there no way back?
I think one of the concerns that we have is actually that we enter into a period in which tightening of financing conditions can actually discourage investment overall and also investment in the net zero transition. And actually, one piece of work that we did this year was to look at what brings firms to invest in energy efficiency and in the net zero transition, where the net zero transition is not only energy efficiency, it's the whole of mitigation and adaptation. And what we see is, in fact, that you have a combination of factors. During the crisis, you had high energy prices that were incentivizing investment in the energy transition, in the energy efficiency, but you had uncertainty that was discouraging investment overall. But with energy efficiency was repaying itself quickly. So actually the net positive effect was to accelerate investment in the energy efficiency side. In the net zero transition, the whole of climate investment, I think the two were balancing completely. So at the end, the net effect was not an incentive to further invest. Now we also add the tightening of financing conditions, so it's another factor going against more investment happening. So actually you need to create more condition for investment to go. And I think the way to go is very much to push again on the importance of fast net zero transition. I kind of agree that the price signal is extremely important, and I think the carbon pricing signal is extremely important, and somehow the compensating measures to support companies' competitiveness, etc., somehow distort this price incentive. And I think on the other side, everything else that is delaying investment, like the time for approval, I think that is something really that needs to be addressed. The fact that at the approval level process for certain projects, it's really long. We had recently a similar conversation in Germany, where it came was they were talking about long delay for the approval of putting the solar panel in your rooftop. And then it came that at the federal level, the law was passed to put a maximum time for giving the approval. But at the local level, they didn't know that it was passed. So they were still applying uncertain timing for giving the approval. So it's all these small things that make a huge difference in the moment in which a project has to be on the plate. So I think that if Europe gets right in all these simplification, a lot of projects will also come. The other thing I wanted to mention, I think there is a long discussion on how can be the transformation of those hard-to-abate sector and generally the high energy intensive industries. And there I think a lot of concern comes on what's the right incentive for the transformation. So when will this industry really transform and take the effort for the transformation? In our survey, something that Matteo was not showing, we ask firms also according to their energy intensity, what's their incentive to enter into innovative business areas and technologies. And what you see is that there is a slight, but if you look at the very high energy intensive industry, yes, they tend to be slightly more likely to transform rather than the average of the firm. So there is a little bit the pressure of the most energy intensive industry to transform. But there, grants and support really make a difference. And actually at the European level, Europe overall, you have much more the high energy intensive that transform, they have access to grant, and those that not transform, they don't have access to grants. If you look in some part of Europe, in Central Eastern Europe, you still see that grants go to everybody, not only to those transforming. So the price incentive, I think, are very important to get it right if we want to accelerate the transformation.
Thank you. You're closing.
Well, I believe or I hope that the current marginal price of energy of 25 euros is not the reason why we would see a slowdown. And I would have a couple of others. The one is the EU has committed to have in the Next Generation EU fund over 700 billion euros of funds available, over 300 billion euros are coming in for grants. This means this is equity for free. So if we as a society are not being capable to deploy 300 billion euros which are coming in for free and making decent projects, we have other issues. So this is the other reason why I'm deeply convinced that this transition will go on. And this merit order price hopefully is not also being used to calculate a 7 years or 10 years or 15 years project. Yes, I agree, it is a political question as well, because in the end of the day we have to ask ourselves what is the right value for us having a sustainable and independent availability of energy confirmed. And this is a little bit higher than the merit order price of in this second. And we must not forget that also, at least if you look at the Austrian energy market, who are the biggest energy producers and who are their shareholders? These are state-related companies, and they have as a shareholder government-related supervisory boards. Well, I think you also could have a strategic decision that you are deciding how much money you want to spend over the next 5 to 10 years based on your returns into this transition. So that's the reason why I'm very constructive and positive that we would see a further progress in this energy transition. Thank you.
Mr. Strebel, yes, please.
Yeah, thank
One
you
by
very
one.
much. One by one. Yeah, I really do hope that the energy transition will go on. I think it would be a big mistake in somehow relativating the EU Green Deal. Beside the high prices which we see now for the fossil energy, we see the high dependency which we have on autocratic states. So I think it's very important to have a renewable energy production within the European Union. And I think there is another reason why it will go on. I'm very convinced about that, because it's a physical fact that is getting warmer and warmer every year. I have the figures from Vienna in mind. I think they are not too different from the figures of other European cities. If you are thinking of the heat days you have, this is a day where the temperature is higher than 30 degrees centigrade. Yeah? We had in the climate period of 1960 to 1990, we had 10 heat days per year. In the year 2019, we had 44, so 4 times more heat days. Even on average, we had 22 heat days. And it's even worse if you think of this, what the meteorologists call tropic night. That's a night where it's warmer than 20 degrees. We had in the climate period from 60 to 90, we had 2 tropic nights per year. And I can remember when I was a student, for example, I studied in Vienna, you had really just a few days per year where it was really warm during night. In the meantime, we have on average 6 tropical nights per year. In the year 2020, we had 15. And the point is that a heat day is followed by a tropical night, and then another heat day and another tropical night. And I really think when there will be a hot summer again, if there will be some, I don't know, heavy raining events or whatever. So I think the facts are really clear. So I'm really convinced and I'm positively minded that all the electors and the people, they will see this change and they will feel this change, and they will see that there is need for action.
Thank you. Mr. Pizek, your closing remarks, please.
Yeah. So I do think we need low energy prices, but we of course need high fossil prices, right? So gas needs to be expensive, and currently it's not again on the stock exchange. So I think that's where we need to get at, right? We need to use less oil, less gas, but we need to still have cheap energy, because our standard of living relies on it, right? We need to be efficient with it, yes, but it still needs to be cheap, and that's where we need to get it. And I'm a little bit skeptical of saying, okay, we just need the price signal and then the market will get it done. Because right now prices are going down again, and if prices stay low for longer now, then that price signal will fade. And companies will ultimately say, okay, well, I'm not going to invest that much, there's not going to be that much return. I think we do need a steadily increasing carbon price, but I do believe it would be better if it was managed, right? Like a CO2 tax, for example, that rises every year constantly, so it's predictable, like the bank knows what it has to calculate in projects. If we just leave it to the emissions trading system and the stock market price, there's a reason that the former Nobel Prize winner, Robert Shiller, has said there's irrational exuberance in the stock market, right? Prices go up, then prices go down. I'm not sure that this market price model for the energy market is always the best one when it comes to predictability and ultimately when it comes to long-term welfare. And I think we need a little bit more management there, political management, and also perhaps a different form of company organization in the energy market, more cooperatives, less profit maximizing companies. A lot of government ownership so that ultimately all the subsidies that go to this sector, end up also in the coffers of the government again indirectly, and not in private hands.
Thank you very much. Thanks for debating with us. Before I invite Ms. Birgit Niessner, I would like to hand over to our guests in the audience and as well online. In order to stay on schedule, I would kindly ask you to ask short questions and probably directly to our panelists. Yes, there I have one hand and then another.
Thank you.
A third hand, and then I would like to invite someone online from the chat function to ask their questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very stimulating discussion. I have two questions. One goes to the bankers on the panel, and it is related to the fact that we here at the Central Bank and the European Central Bank as well are trying to estimate the risk component of climate change and climate change risks, and also to incorporate it in our pricing. And I wonder whether you are doing the same, whether banks in Austria or the EIB itself is already trying to gauge the risk aspect and then also to implement or incorporate actually the risk into its loan rates, for example, and whether you think that this will then also incentivize firms to invest less in these climate risky businesses, or whether you think that the risk increment is so small that it doesn't make a difference. And my second question goes to Mr. Strebel, because you spoke about the investment needs for the city of Vienna, and you talked about transport as being the biggest part, and I was thinking that actually Vienna has a very good public transport system, so I wonder whether we need to incentivize the private sector to invest more in clean energy for the transportation, and what kind of incentives policymakers could set here.
Thank you.
Well, I can start with the first question. Yes, of course, we do incorporate them, and you would know the technical terms when talking about these different impacts when it comes to the current climate environment. The one would be where you have physical risk and where do you have transition risk. So physical risk, I think every one of us can easily assume, you have a hot house, as we have also just heard. Just imagine what a hot house effect may mean to you. And if it's too long ongoing, people are suffering to an extent where it's a real trouble. The other one, physical risk, if we have this flooding and suddenly the mortgage you gave to a house which is then suddenly being in the floods, these are the two components. There was a stress test conducted by the ECB for the entire industry, and the effect, at least based on the scenarios we have received and tried to convert them into bank internal parameters, is compared to our total portfolio, and we have 100 billion euros of loans, and the total impact of risk costs would be below 40 basis points for the total portfolio. So that's and this is for this long horizon, and what I currently see that is more giving more lever. 2 or 3 things. The one is that anyway, you know, if somebody would come up with a mortgage request in a red area, he is challenged because you would, of course, assume a much higher loss in the case of flooding. So this is a credit policy question and could also be easily assumed and introduced, and rule setters could just say, well, guys, listen, if you provide financing into a red area, loss given default must be assumed at 60–70%. Easy as that, and we finish the discussion. The other one is that credit policy, we also introduced a credit policy when it comes to coal financing. We are not doing it anymore. Easy as that. Nevertheless, interesting, you would find on the market other banks who would still be looking, because you could argue, well, if it's coal financing, so coal firing power energy producing company, you could say, well, if it's on the latest technology, you know, you're still reducing CO2 because you can do energy producing with coal firing with 400 kilos, or you can also do it with 800 kilos of emission. But we are just not doing it anymore. So the policies are being much faster than you saying, well, hey, let's add here or there are 5 or 10 basis points on the cost of financing because you're not as green as we would hope for. So the policy, and the other one is that this would be where you would disincentivize, but on the other hand, we also incentivizing with our funding costs if it's really clear ESG linked. So our first line of defense, our colleagues on the client-facing side, they get cheaper funding costs if they really come up with a clear ESG compliant project. Thanks for the question.
Maybe I can say something also, because the European Investment Bank is also a bank. So we are a European institution, but we also are a bank, and we act like if we were supervisors. So we have an indirect system for supervision. So we are under the same pressure that a normal bank would have in terms of the transformation on the risk management side. On the active lending side, our lending policy prevents us to intervene in certain sectors. But then on the risk management side, we also had to pass through the various phases. The first one was assessing the exposure to risk, both the physical and transition of our own portfolio, and we have done all the mapping. And then through the stress test, we also have been passing through the stress test to see what's the resilience in terms of resilience to the materialization of risk. But then I think when you look at the assessing the exposure to risk, I think it's very easy to do. Very easy. Nothing is easy, but it's doable also on the banking sector side. But where it becomes complicated to me is how do you really associate a PD and a LGD to the risk? And in that point of view, so once you know I am building that this building is in a risky area, then what's the probability of default and the loss given default of the loan in that area? And I think that part is something where we will see an evolution going forward. And it's all the issue of data quality and what are the data we are talking about. And that will be a slow process of adaptation going forward. We are working, and I see we are working with various central banks in the context of the Vienna Initiative in Central Eastern Europe, with commercial banks and regulators to try to understand what are all these gaps, and I think the data quality and how to build reliable data on exposure to this risk, but particularly this PD and LGD, I think is something where we will see a lot of market development in the future. And if you think another interesting story, insurance companies have always been quite good, probably the best one in the insurance, the climate risk so far. And after a number of exceptional events in the last year, they start insuring some areas. So it means that they also got it wrong what was the pricing, and because climate risk, the intensity of risk is increasing, etc., the pricing they were attaching was probably not wrong, otherwise there would be, was not correct, otherwise there would be a business model. I think then that on this we will see market development, but again, it's something that will take a bit of time. But then when it's fully internalized and when you really price this risk, I think it will have an effect on the business also.
Thank you. And the second question.
Yeah, concerning the transportation sector. So 40% of the CO2 emissions of Vienna, they are coming from the transportation sector, and Vienna has a very good public transportation system, so both is true. Both is true. Vienna has quite a low per capita emission of CO2. It's a bit below 4 tons per capita per year. Other comparable cities like Munich, they have 6, Hamburg has 8, yeah. Even Amsterdam, which is very often considered as a very green city, it has a bit more CO2 emissions than Vienna has. Copenhagen is a bit lower than Vienna. This depends mainly on the share of public transportation in the full transportation system. So we have a modal split, as you call it, of about 37%, if I have the figure correctly in mind. So 37% of all the transportation is done by public transportation in Vienna. That's very high. Other cities have a comparably higher rate of cycling or pedestrians, for example. But still, Vienna has a very good, very low, good carbon footprint compared to other European cities. But still, given this number, 40% of the emissions are coming from the transportation system.
Thank you very much. We have another question. You already got the microphone.
Yeah, thank you. And for the sake of time, I will put it very simply in a way that you and the panel can simply answer it with yes or no. My question will take a bit longer. Nevertheless, we talked about the energy system, and we did talk very little about an important bottleneck in the energy system, that is actually the infrastructure, that is grids, charging systems, grids, of course, regional, interregional, and also local grids, and other things, which, yeah, whatever. But the question is now to you: if you would have put more focus on these infrastructure issues, would the discussion of today have gone in the similar or quite same direction, or would we have to debate everything in another way? Yes or no? Okay.
I'm glad I don't have to answer, so...
Well, that's easy. I think it's an integral part of energy producing, and let me share with you an anecdote. There was a representative of an Austrian big energy producer. They are also providing project know-how to neighboring countries. And there was EU accession fund available. So in my naive world, I thought, hey, that's cool. You know, they have high mountains, there is EU money available, they have water So why not proposing that their energy infrastructure, hydropower plants is being produced? You know, we as a bank could do the mezzanine financing or the senior financing, 300 million euros are available. But then I had a very unpleasant wake-up call, because it was said, well, to produce the energy is one thing, but you need to have the grid. So I think for me this is an integral part. So it was a long answer to your short question, yes or no. But I think since it's integral, hopefully the discussion would have been in the same one, maybe a little bit more differentiated. But you cannot do any energy transition discussion without considering the infrastructure and the grid.
I fully agree. It's a central part, actually. The net zero transition need infrastructure, and not only. And the grid, exactly what you say, it's a fundamental importance. But I think it also brings back the discussion we had before. Why do we talk about Iberia and the rest, and there is no transmission between France and Spain? So I think. We have to think at the infrastructure, and we have to think also at cross-border infrastructure, and that's particularly important also for competition issues.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. But it's easy to answer. Infrastructure is key, of course, at all stages. So I think we have to enforce all the European interconnectors, like between the Iberian Peninsula and France, but not only. There are also difficulties at the German-Austrian border, for example. So there are a lot of things to do, and especially in the low voltage grids. So they have a completely new role in the green energy system. So. For example, in most of all households, the grids are designed to deliver electricity from the central power station to the households. If the energy production now moves to the households because of photovoltaics, because of small windmills, but mainly because of photovoltaics, there is a lot of energy which has to be collected from the energy supplier from the households, because the photovoltaic panels, they are producing energy during midday, for example, on a sunny day, but nobody is at home and can use the energy there. So we have to collect the energy from the customers and bring it back to the system. And this, of course, are completely different requirements than an electric grid has when you're just supplying it. So there is a huge investment necessary in the grid infrastructure, because it gets a completely different role than it has now.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I think the problems are somewhat similar. There's always the question of distribution, and there's always the question of bringing climate policies together with social policies. For example, if you specifically about the electricity grid, one basic fact: households pay more for renewable energy renewable subsidies and electricity grid expansion / cost. Than energy companies do per unit of electricity. They pay 4 to 5 times as much. Right? So there's also, I think, we need to talk about who pays for the transition and who's actually already paying now. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have one third question from the audience.
Also, thank you for this very interesting discussion from my side. But one thing that struck me once again is that you could easily get the impression when there's talk about green transition, then it's development of new renewable capacity alone. But when you start to read the assessment report of the UN's Intergovernmental Climate Change scientists, then you learn that there is more to the picture, that there is a very powerful ally with fighting climate change, a very powerful ally that accounts for taking up more than 50% of the carbon that we emit. It's not going in the atmosphere, it's going elsewhere. So our very powerful ally in this matter is nature. And we don't only have the Paris framework, but since last autumn, last winter, also the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And now to my question, especially addressed towards the European Investment Bank, but yeah, all the others are also invited to comment. How do you make sure to align all the renewable policies with this global biodiversity framework of Kunming and Montreal? Thank you.
I think we are actually working on the alignment also to nature and biodiversity. We have been developing our own policies that we are now putting forward, and we are also working with other multilateral development bank in a working group to try to operationalize it. It takes a little bit more time because it's the new wave, but we are working in the direction and it's being operationalized.
Thank you very much. We have time for one last question from the chat, probably, and then I'm afraid we have to cut loose.
Okay, so I will read the question from the chat to you, and it's going again to Mr. Mösenbacher and I think also Mr. Revoltella, talking about the underwriting of energy investment projects and the de-risking of these investments. Are banks willing to finance energy projects also at the very innovative stage? Since innovation is inherently risky, this stage of investment is often left to venture capital or equity investors, not to banks. Are banks willing to take these risks?
Well, I think that's a very important question, and sorry, you know, if it sounds now boring a little bit, banking algebra. So if I provide a loan, I need as a bank some, and I'm now shortcutting, so those who deeply know, they will say, hey, he's shortcutting too much. I need 8 units of equity. So I provide 8 to 10 units of equity. So I provide a loan of 100, and capital requirement for me is around about 10 to 12 units. If I do the same amount, so the same 100, in terms of equity, it is 30 to 40, depends on the equity structure. So you can see that our society has decided that banks are good for taking and providing the leverage and the financing. The equity for a bank is really, really, really expensive. And you have seen this in my little example. So on the one example, I need 10 units of equity to provide 100 of financing capacity, and in the other case, I need 30 to 40 units of equity that I can provide 100 of equity. So that's the context. What we are doing is we invite from time to time for different elevator labs where we invite companies, but here we're talking really small money. If it's really highly innovative, where you can also say, well, if the innovation does not work out well, well, we also accept, as you indicated by your question, the risk that it does not materialize. But for this pure innovation-driven vehicles, where it's about equity investment, of course, they also would then benefit on the upside if things work out nicely. I also heard from the Vice President of the EIB clearly saying, guys, listen, we would be willing also to provide financing and capacity for equity, but on broad scale, equity financing for banking is extremely expensive. But maybe, Deborah, you could also add from your side.
I think on our side we have the advantage of being a big institution and a big group other than a bank, so we are quite active both with our EIF and the venture capital, also in terms of financing innovation and in all the part of the innovation and all the stages of the innovation. But also we have from the bank side, we have developed a product that is a venture debt that also, and we are looking at more and more at a way to support the scaling up until the manufacturing part, entering into the manufacturing production. And we think that's exactly the part where we need to be, particularly now, and particularly with the net zero transition. Particularly because understanding, so you have to develop a market. Even on the venture capital side, you need to develop a part of the market that is capable of analyzing the different technologies. So if you start supporting 2-3 funds that really have a focus on the net zero transition on different areas, they build the skills and you create the venture capital market that can support this kind of innovation. And on the other side, the same on the banking side. So we are doing it, and we think it's really the part where we should be to support the innovation side in the net zero transition.
Thank you very much for listening and for talking to us. I'm afraid we need to come to an end. I now have the pleasure and the honor to invite Ms. Birgit Niessner, Director of the Austrian National Bank, for her closing remarks. Thank you very much.
I hope the microphone works here. So thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much to the audience. I'm happy about your active participation, especially as this visit of the EIB already has turned into a yearly ritual, which I highly appreciate because you really put the mirror into our face and you show the pain points of the Austrian economy in terms of investment. And again, listening to you, Matteo, today, I had the impression sometimes that the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. So you really had quite controversial facts. So we have in Austria, for instance, a low share of investment into innovation, but we are quite good. We have a high percentage of the use of advanced digital technologies. Or, next example, we are number 1 on investment in energy efficiency and renewables, but 31% of the Austrian companies see transition as a risk. So obviously it's not very, the mind frame is not so easy to go towards this green transition, and it seems to be a back and forth way if I look at your numbers, but highly interesting. And of course, I mean, we have today put the focus on the energy system and financing of the energy system, but the message coming out of your report is something what Mr. Pizzak also has said. We are in another transition as well. I mean, this lack of skilled labor, which is partly related to our demographic situations or other factors of the economy, is something which also will not go away and will keep us busy. So thank you for showing us where we stand, as you do every year. And now turning to the panel, I really must say I liked your first question. We found out, Mrs. Delcheva, that Greta Thunberg and Vladimir Putin, they don't have a common agenda. Very nicely put. But then I was a little bit irritated because, I mean, looking at, I mean, the leitmotif question of today was how to finance the energy system. And suddenly I had the feeling that the panel goes a little bit off topic because everybody, who is active on the corporate side, who is active in IB, was talking about the administrative bottlenecks. And I'm not dismissing this or diminishing it, but it was really interesting that there was a broad consensus on the panel that if we cannot deploy projects within a reasonable time, we better not even start the discussion on financing, or the predictability of the operating environment, as Mrs. Revoltella formulated it, is key. So I would say that this was a very important stream of your discussion. And then the panel turned towards the financing questions. I would say that we will all see the sources of financing coming from supranationals, coming from banks, coming out of the profits, of the cash flow of the companies. I would say the panel had a different weighting of those factors. Yeah, so it's some people gave less importance to bank financing. It was very interesting what you pointed out, Mr. Mösenbacher, that bonds is obviously not the game changer on this market. But we all know that this crowding in of private investments, what the supers do, will not go away, is very key for the whole sector. I also really liked then that it was Mr. Picek who took us beyond this financing discussion and said, but financing, whether it's indirectly via carbon dioxide tax or via subsidies, is only 2 out of 3 options which we have. So you pointed to not only the social question of the green transition, but also to the regulatory side of the green transition. And you quoted as a positive example what happened to the e-vehicles, and that we would not have e-vehicles driving around so much if we didn't have this regulation some time before. So it was a very colorful discussion. I must say that I really liked it, obviously, that it concluded on a positive tone. I have the strong feeling that, I mean, it's not a problem which will go away. The climate risks we are facing. Sometimes we delved into technical side of it as well. But I also see that very different stakeholders, as represented on the panel, go towards one common agenda. So it's something where I think, I mean, you had completely different perspectives, but the agenda of the society, if I listen to the 4 or 5 to you, seems to be really firm, and there is no point of return. This will not go away, that we will all go in this direction. I learned something about my own city. I did not know this, up 2,800 hot topics, which are hot sources which are below us. Yeah, so this is really interesting. And that's exactly, I mean, you tackle it from this municipality level. I mean, it's a big municipality, yeah, but you have a concrete plan, and of course it started before Mr. Putin did what he did. Your conclusions on whether the energy transition will go on or not pointed again, touched new topics, political economy. You're completely right. It's a challenge to digest the RRF funds, the Next Generation EU. It looks easy to absorb money, to spend money. It is not, as we know. Deborah was talking about price incentives. Of course, again, this urgency which we feel because we have the hot days in Vienna is something which makes me confident we will go on doing it. And I also found some common denominator even between Mr. Mösenbacher and Mr. Picek, because what you meant with political management is a little bit what I thought you mean when you say, well, we have state actors in the energy sector, and they also should take the societal responsibility to move on with the transition. So I hope you had a rich afternoon as I had it, and I know I'm standing between you and the refreshments, but I stop now. Thank you for being here at the OeNB.